Hi everybody, welcome back and thanks for watching. I'm struggling with my hay fever today, so if I start sneezing or if I sound like I'm underwater, that's the reason why. So I'll keep this one short today. A few people have asked for this because miracles can be an area of the course that some people find a little bit tricky. I'm not going to try and take on the whole topic, but I'm going to focus on what people in my experience find to be the trickiest bit, which is David Hume and Maurice Wiles, their views, and also particularly this realist, anti-realist distinction that we have to get our heads around with miracles. So I'm just going to try and cover that and we'll see how we go. All right then, so a few things it's really important to know going into this. Realist and anti-realist isn't the same as true and false. So it's not as straightforward as saying realists think miracles happen and anti-realists think they don't happen. That might be true sometimes, but that's not really what we're doing here. Realists and anti-realists aren't yes and no. They're just two different understandings of what we mean when we talk about miracles. Two different definitions, if you like. So to give you an example in terms of Hume and Wiles, Hume defines miracles in a realist sense, but he doesn't think they actually happen. Now we're going to unpack Hume's ideas a little bit as we go through. On the other hand, Wiles is a theist, so he believes in God, which Hume doesn't, but he takes an anti-realist view of miracles. So he doesn't define them as literal events. He thinks they're symbolic, and he thinks the power of them is in the effect that they have on people rather than in the event itself. Whereas for Hume, it's all about the event itself, and that's what he kind of denies. So let me say a little about Hume for you. So David Hume, we're probably quite familiar with him by now because he comes up in lots of areas of the course. He defines a miracle as a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity. Now, Hume's quite fond of these long words, so let me break that down for you. A transgression of a law of nature essentially means a law of nature's being broken. So something like if you put a pan of water on a gas flame and it froze instead of boiling. That would be a transgression of the law of nature. That would break the laws of nature. That would go against everything we know about how the universe works. And a particular volition of the deity, volition means a want or a wish, and deity is referring to God or another kind of higher power. So the whole thing basically means he's taking his definition of miracle to mean when a law of nature is broken because God wants to break it and therefore God does break it. So he's saying that if a miracle happened, that's what it would be. What he's kind of doing here is he's assuming that that's how religious people see miracles. They see them as genuine events where God kind of reaches into the world and does something to break the laws of nature. He's saying that if a miracle happened, that would be what it was. But he does not think that such events happen. So even though he's got a realist definition of a miracle, he doesn't think miracles actually happen. That's important to know. Let's get into that a little bit more. So as I just said, he's assuming that religious believers, so for example Christians, see miracles as literal, actual events. So if we take a Christian example like the resurrection, he's assuming that Christians believe that that was actually a real event in time that actually occurred. Now, he claims that any such events should be rejected. So if we heard a report of somebody being raised from the dead, which is what the resurrection is, of course, he thinks we should reject that. He's an empiricist, he's all about evidence, and he's got this quote, which is quite a nice one to learn and use. He says, "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence." In other words, we should always believe whatever we've got the most evidence for. So all of our evidence, all of our experience points to the fact that once people die, they aren't raised from the dead. They don't come back to life. So if that was to happen even one time, he thinks we should discount it. It's far more likely that we're wrong or that we're mistaken or that we've been tricked than that a miracle has actually occurred, because we have massively, massively more evidence that that doesn't happen than that it does. So he goes further. He takes 4 kind of points, which I've got here for you, to argue about why he doesn't think miracles actually do happen. So the first one, there's never been a miracle reported, says Hume, that has been supported by sufficient reliable witnesses. Now, he doesn't really say what an appropriate amount of reliable witnesses would be, but according to him, that's never happened. So that's not a good reason to believe in them. He says that he describes humans as naturally credulous. So what that means is people want to believe in miracles. And when somebody tells you a miracle story, you find it very wonderful, you might find it very surprising, and you might want to believe it, so you kid yourself into believing it. But actually, he says you shouldn't do that because there's insufficient evidence. His third argument is that miracle stories come from people who don't know any better. They come from what he calls ignorant and barbarous nations, people who are not educated, people who are not good thinkers. And finally, every religion, says Hume, has miracle stories. They can't all be right because they're from different faith traditions, therefore they're going to be contradictory, therefore they cancel each other out, therefore we can't take any of them seriously. So that's a summary of Hume's arguments against miracles. Are they any good? Depends who you ask. If you're someone who tends to agree with Hume, you're probably going to think they're decent. But actually they can all be challenged. Now, the first thing that's worth saying here is that Hume can't prove that miracles don't happen any more than someone can prove that miracles do happen. He's doing an inductive argument. He's trying to show what is probably true based on the evidence, but he can't absolutely prove it. All of the points that we just talked about can be challenged. So just to give you an example, what he was saying about ignorant and barbarous nations, at the time he was alive, many miracle stories were emerging from countries like France and Italy, which had some of the highest levels of education and philosophical thought in the world. And then the final point is possibly the most compelling. His whole thing about you should believe what you've got the most evidence for, and therefore you should ignore miracles, that would make no sense to a religious believer, because it doesn't matter that miracles don't have a lot of evidence. It's kind of the whole point that they're an exception. If you think about Jesus' resurrection, if that hadn't been a one-off, if that hadn't been something that just happened to Jesus, it wouldn't have power. So the whole point is that it's a one-off and it's quite unbelievable. Okay, so let's switch gears and look a little bit at Maurice Wiles. Now, he's a 20th century thinker, so quite a good way on from Hume. And he was a Christian, he was a theist, but he rejected the view that miracles are events that take place in history. And that makes him an anti-realist. So that makes him different from Hume. Hume is defining a miracle as an event that actually happens, but he doesn't think they do happen. Wiles goes about it differently. He doesn't think that they're real, literal events. He thinks the best way to understand them is as symbols. So let me unpack this for you a bit. If we could ask Wiles how many miracles actually happened, I think he would say that one miracle happened, which was creation. So that was an act of God to create everything that we have. But once it was done, it's either done because it was good and therefore it didn't need any tinkering with, or it's a kind of ongoing miracle and God is sustaining it all the time. It's not quite clear what Wiles means there, but what he's saying very clearly is that God doesn't need to keep tinkering. God doesn't need to kind of reach in every so often and do a miracle. Because if he did do that, he wouldn't be a good God. So this is a problem that you've probably encountered with miracles. Why do some people get them and not others? Why does God cure some people's cancer and not others? Why does God answer some people's prayers and not others? So Wiles kind of rejects the idea that God would do that, because if God was like that, God wouldn't be worth worshipping. Thinking about Jesus' resurrection, Wiles thinks it's totally reasonable to see that as a myth. Look at it holistically, look at it as a whole story. Don't worry too much about whether or not it actually took place. Think about what's the message of it. What effect does the story have on people? What's it trying to say about God? That's how he sees it. So again, Wiles' view is that God isn't kind of absent. God is continuing to sustain us. God is continuing to work in creation, but not through miracles, not through random interventions, not through tinkering. He's doing it much more kind of subtly than that. So finally, just to do a little comparison to Hume and Wiles, as we've established, Hume's an atheist. So he's utterly baffled that anyone could believe that there would be a God who would intervene. So he defines a miracle as an act done by God that breaks the laws of nature, but he defines it to show what it is that he's rejecting. He rejects the idea that that can happen, and he's got all those criticisms. So you might think that brings him into a lot of conflict with Wiles. It doesn't really, because Wiles has got a completely different definition of a miracle. Wiles also doesn't think that a miracle can be something that breaks the laws of nature. Wiles thinks that miracle stories can have a lot of effects on people. They can really inspire people, they can strengthen people's faith, but the miracles don't actually need to have literally happened for this to be meaningful, for this to be something that's important. So to kind of back up another kind of anti-realist stance on miracles, you could look at someone like R.F. Holland, who's got the example of the child on the train tracks. That's quite a famous example. But what I hope you've got from this is a little bit of a better handle on the whole realist, anti-realist thing. Practice explaining that yourself in your revision. Maybe have a go at 1 or 2 essays on this, put together some plans, get some feedback on them. That's probably the best way through this topic. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't yet, because I'm hopefully going to try and drop some more videos as we get closer to exams. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.